Hello, I'm Mike Roussos, a software engineer on the DevDiv customer engagement team. And in this video, I'm going to show you how you can use Azure Migrate application and code assessment to get ready to re-platform your applications into Azure. So Azure Migrate application and code assessment is a new tool that's available for both .NET and Java scenarios that will analyze your solution looking for things in the source code or the configuration that could prevent the application from working in Azure Platform as a Service environments like Azure App Service, Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Container Apps, or Azure Spring Apps. This is different from existing Azure Migrate functionality because up until now, Azure Migrate's been great at scanning your infrastructure, your web servers, inventorying that infrastructure, helping you understand what resources you'll need to deploy in Azure, and even automating the migration of virtual machines, servers, databases, IIS instances into Azure. But a piece that's always been missing was the ability to look inside of the applications themselves for what might happen. Now, there is the App Service Migration Assistant tool, which does a good job of analyzing the IIS web servers, looking for any web server configuration that might need updated, and even giving you the ability to pick up an application from on-prem, drop it into Azure App Service. But Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment goes one level deeper, looking at the source code itself to understand if you have code patterns or API usage that might need to change as you prepare to take your application into Azure. Let's take a look at how it works. So where you're going to start is with our documentation at learn.microsoft.com. If you go to learn.microsoft.com/azure/migrate/appcat/overview, you'll get documentation explaining how to get started with Azure Migrate application and code assessment. Again, we have links here for both doing this with Java applications and .NET applications. For the Java applications, you will use a command line tool that will assess your solution and produce a report of potential issues. On the .NET side, there's a command line tool that's installed using the .NET CLI. So you would do .NET tool install to install the Azure Migrate application and code assessment tool. There's also a Visual Studio extension. The extension will give you a UI inside of Visual Studio where you can do this same analysis. If you're going to use the Visual Studio extension, you'll need to go to the Visual Studio Marketplace and install the Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment extension. It requires Visual Studio 2022. If you don't have that version of Visual Studio, you can download the free Community Edition of Visual Studio 2022. It works great. Or if you don't want to use VS, of course, there is always the command line solution that I talked about earlier. But let's go ahead and look at how this extension works in Visual Studio. So with the Application and Code Assessment extension installed, I now have a new option when I right-click in my Solution Explorer, and that's this Re-Platform to Azure option. Clicking that brings up this new UI where I can manage my Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment reports. Let's click New Report. Here, we choose which projects in our solution we want to analyze. This will analyze any of the checked projects as well as any projects that they depend on through project-to-project dependencies. So in this case, I have 3 projects in my solution, but I only need to choose the top-level entry point project. I'm looking at an old eShop sample. This is a simple ASP.NET MVC app running on .NET Framework 4.6.2, I want to say, that implements just a very simple sample e-commerce solution. We have our ASP.NET MVC project, as well as 2 small helper libraries that it depends on. I only need to check my MVC project here. Since it depends on these other 2, they'll get pulled in automatically. On the next screen, I choose whether I want to analyze source code or also binary dependencies. Now, I always recommend you leave this first box checked, as that's going to give you insight into the code that you own and that you have control over changing if there are things that need updated for this solution to work better once you re-platform into Azure. You can also choose binary dependencies. Honestly, I like to do one report with this checked and one without. If you check it, we will also, in addition to scanning your source code, look at any binaries that your solution depends on. So this would be things like a reference to a DLL. Maybe you're using an assembly out of a global assembly cache. Or most commonly, this would be references to NuGet packages. By checking this box, we'll scan the IL inside those NuGet DLLs to look for any potential issues there as well. Now, that means that checking both these boxes is going to give you the most complete set of issues that you need to be on the lookout for. But checking binary dependencies will also produce a lot more issues, and these issues could be lower priority than the ones in your own source code. Just because I'm using a particular NuGet package doesn't mean I'm going down every code path. Oftentimes, the way to make sure that your NuGet packages will work with Azure is to just go out, look and see if they have a new up-to-date version that you should be using, check the community, maybe in their GitHub project or on NuGet.org to see whether things are likely to work. Because even if you find something in the binaries, you don't have access to the source code, so it's a little bit trickier to figure out how to address those. But if there is a binary dependency you have and you want some visibility into whether it's likely to just work out of the box on Azure, or if there might be a couple things that don't work the same way they do on premise, you can check this box. For now, I'm just going to analyze the source code and settings to get that simple initial view. When I click Analyze, it goes through, analyzes all of the projects in my solution. eShop's a very small sample, so it happens very quickly. In a larger solution, it might take 3-5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes for extremely large solutions. So it's not instantaneous, but it doesn't take very long, on the order of seconds or minutes. And then in this dashboard, we get a view of all of the different incidents that were identified. We see here that the tool scanned 3 projects, found 15 different types of issues, which fall into these categories over here, and that there were 37 total incidents. They're estimated at 107 story points. The story points here are a unitless measure that allow you to compare different reports for relative cost and complexity to get ready for Azure. Now, a story point doesn't correspond to an hour or a day or even to whatever it is that your organization means when you say story point. But if I come in here and look at the incidents sorted by projects, they allow me to do things like recognize that my MVC project has incidents totaling 101 story points, whereas each of the small helper libraries only have 3 story points worth of work required. So I can say, oh, the bulk of the work is going to be in updating my MVC app. The helper libraries should be comparatively simple to get ready to run in Azure App Service or AKS or wherever it is I want to end up. You also could compare this solution to another solution. Let's say I analyzed a solution that came back with 400 story points worth of work. Well, then I can look at that and say, between these two solutions, the other one that requires 400 story points will require more work, effort, and time to get ready for Azure than this one. Digging into specific projects, you can see the issues for those particular projects. You get the same sort of dashboard we had before, as well as the ability to see issues sorted by the component, which would be the source file they occur in, or if we had checked that binary dependency box, a component could also be a DLL. Or you can see the issues sorted by their type. So here are the different types of issues that occur in my MVC project. You can also see when we dig in to a particular component, we're shown the specific instances of this issue that happened with links to where in the source code this occurs. So here we have a description explaining that my catalog controller is using MSMQ. We have a snippet here of the source code from that controller that was doing that. We have an explanation that using MSMQ is likely not to work in Azure App Service because we are depending on a queue that is likely running locally on this machine or on another machine on my network that won't be available when I'm running an Azure App Service. And we're given the recommendation that we should look at more cloud-native messaging solutions like Azure App Service or Azure Service Bus or Azure Storage Queues instead. We also get some links to relevant documentation that I can use to go learn more. Like I said, we can actually click this link to go directly to where in my project the offending code lives. So here I see we do have a helper method in my catalog controller that is queuing messages in an MSMQ message queue whenever a new item is added to the catalog. This is presumably for some other process to come along and take some action when new items are added to a catalog. Maybe we need to tweet out a notification, or we need to send an email to somebody or something. So again, this shows me exactly where it is in my project I need to consider updating to use something like Azure Service Bus instead. We also have little green squiggles here that will correspond to the incidents that were detected by the application and code assessment process. We also have these drop-down boxes. So let's suppose I went into my project, I read these docs that were linked, and I made a change so that instead of depending on MSMQ, I'm going to use Azure Service Bus. Well, I could come in here and mark these two issues as resolved. Click the Save button to save my report. And now this report saves that state so that I can come back to it later and resume my review of issues, and I will always see that those ones have already been addressed. If there were a false positive, you could also just click the Not Applicable if this wasn't something that required a change. So this is the way that you're able to use this report to go through, understand what these issues are that you need to review before you migrate to Azure. We also, in addition to those details, we also give every one of the issues a severity, mandatory, optional, potential, or information. In this case, we had 6 mandatory issues. These are issues that the tool believes very likely need to be addressed prior to replatforming into Azure. If we come over here and take a look at all of the issues, we can see that the Q issues we just talked about are an example of a mandatory issue because MSMQ is not going to work in Azure App Service. We also have optional issues. These are situations where you don't need to make any change for things to work in the cloud, but there's an opportunity to improve your application. So for example, let's say that you had some secrets in your web config file. That would be an optional issue because, of course, reading information and settings out of a web config file works fine in Azure. You don't need to make any changes there. Everything will keep working the same in Azure as it did on-premise. But there's an opportunity now that you're going to be running in Azure, you can take advantage of services like Azure Key Vault to store those secrets more securely, make them easier to manage, and make them available to multiple applications all at once. So that sort of thing would be identified as an optional issue, something that isn't going to block your replatform into Azure, but is an opportunity to improve your application now that you're getting the benefits that you're going to have available running inside of Azure. And then finally, we have potential issues. These are the most common issues. Potential issues are those that might require a code change but might not. And these are issues that are just for a developer to go review with their knowledge of how this solution works and make a call about whether something needs to be addressed or not. And there will be details and descriptions helping the developer understand what they should be looking for. For example, let's suppose that my application depends on a database. It reads information from a database, it writes to a database. Is that going to stop me from migrating to Azure? It depends. If that database is available from Azure because it's hosted already in the cloud, or it's running as a Azure SQL DB or something like that, or maybe through a service like ExpressRoute or Hybrid Connections, I've made my on-premise database available to my Azure environment. Well, in all of those cases, this is going to work fine. I can pick my application up, I can put it in Azure App Service, in Azure Kubernetes Service, everything keeps working fine. But let's suppose that the database I'm using exists in my on-premise network, and I don't have a solution like ExpressRoute to make that available to the cloud. Well, now that database dependency represents work I'm going to have to do in order for this application to work in Azure App Service, AKS, ACA, wherever it is that I'm going to be hosting it. Because when I move my application, it's not going to be able to get to that database anymore. So now I need to have a plan in place to migrate my database along with the application, which is a scenario that other Azure Migrate features are super helpful for. Or maybe I need to set up some solution that allows my application to access my on-premise database. Either way, I need to have a plan, I need to think that one through, and so that's a real issue. These sorts of things are called potential because it's not something that the application and code assessment process can determine statically on its own, but it's something of interest that a developer needs to go review. And again, this is going to be a lot of the issues. So you should think about the incidents reported by Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment, not so much as errors, but as items that the dev team needs to review prior to going ahead with your Azure replatform effort. Now, I already showed how you can save these reports, you can update state. We also have an export button. So we can take this same report and we can make it available as a spreadsheet if we export it as CSV. We can make it available as a JSON file that's going to be very machine readable if you have other automation you want to consume these reports. Or, my favorite, we can save it as HTML, which if I do that, will produce a report that I can open up in the browser that looks just like the one in the IDE, but now I'm viewing it outside of Visual Studio. So I can take this HTML exported report, I can share it with colleagues, with management, whatever, so that they also can see where we are with our assessment of what it's going to take to get this application running in Azure. We get all of the same views with projects. We can see the incidents sorted by issue. And if we come in here, you can see that we've even preserved the state so that if I've already done some analysis on my own and I've already updated some of these issues to be marked as resolved or not applicable, that state's preserved in the report as well. All right, so that's just a brief overview of what you can do with Azure Migrate Application and Code Assessment. Again, we have this Visual Studio extension that I've been showing today. There's also a command line tool that you can use to get the same experience from the command line without the Visual Studio dependency. And if you have Java apps, you can come out to our documentation and you can learn about how we have the same tooling experience on the Java side, so you can get very similar reports using a Java command line tool that can help you take those applications, get them ready for Azure. Hope this has been helpful, and happy migrating.